everybody, Gurmy's Coaster Yard here with another episode of Germanator Studios. And in today's episode, we are getting a nice solid start on the Western themed portion of our theme park. And to start, we are extending this gateway between the colonial world and the Western world. And when I built this building, I didn't really know what I was building. Um, but I think it's a small enough building that it could be like a storage area, or maybe it could be an employee break room, or something along those lines. But we're just building a small building here, something to sort of extend the theme of the gateway, and I guess like lay the foundation of what this world will be. I don't know. Maybe I'm just spouting off nonsense, trying to justify building this random building. Nevertheless, we are building an extension of our gateway that is Western themed. And of course, you can see right along the back side here, we're using our favorite go away green color to create a little garage door, and I'll put in some other doors here as well, just to, because it needs doors. That's why we're putting them in. Anyway, um, so yeah, I don't know. I lost my train of thought there. We're off to a great start this episode. Anyhow, um, yeah, so I just thought I'd put this building in here to get started with having a building, and sometimes it helps. Like I use the entrance of this area as sort of an anchor point to start creating this building, and from there that'll help me to sort of figure out. Yeah, I can use the building as a reference point for future scenery or other buildings, and it also just sort of helps establish where I want the border of my world to be. If it wasn't obvious by where the colonial world ends and this one begins, but nevertheless, I think there are any number of reasons that a building like this could work. And then just on the opposite end, I put a little doorway in there. That could definitely be like a storage or janitorial closet or something along those lines. Um, but just for reference, you can see I painted a little line in the terrain there using the color we have been using, or the texture we've been using for our borders in our world. And just so that way I can see when I'm designing what we designed later. Actually, it's probably the title of this video or the thumbnail. So you probably already know that we're designing a wooden roller coaster, but if I decide not to make the title or the thumbnail, there, I spoiled it. Anyhow, just so when I'm building that I put that line there so I would know where the world is going to end, basically, or where the land is going to end. Just have it as a reference point. Anyhow, we are designing a GCI style wooden roller coaster, and it goes through a number of design changes right in the very beginning, because the initial reason I sort of put it in here, at least this portion I'm building right now, is I knew about where I wanted the drop to be and how I wanted everything to be lined up in that respect. So to help with building our little railroad, which you saw me starting, which I have not even talked about yet, to help figure out where that needed to go, I decided to start with the roller coaster. Now this will change quite a lot in the next few minutes, so stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, well, I don't know what to talk about because it's all going to play out on screen anyway. But I guess I'll talk a little bit more about the railroad. So I wanted to have, a nice Western style classic railroad going through our Western town. And I may have mentioned this in a previous episode, but I honestly can't remember if I have or not. But eventually I want this railroad to go into the zoo. So we're going to branch it over there and make another railroad station near the transport, like the monorail stations over there, where our zoo will be eventually. So one thing I'm doing here is building a bridge over the railroad, and I realize I think I forgot to actually make that bridge into a real bridge. So in the next episode, you'll see me create a ramp. So a, it's not just a random wall in the middle of the road, but a bridge so the cars can get over. Kind of similar to like the high bridge on the Cedar Point Causeway, um, which provides access for the waterway underneath, just for boats that want to get from the lake to that little interior lake on the peninsula. Same idea, but for the train instead. And I opted for that instead of having the train go over the road or crossing the road, just to because this is sort of the main road into our resort complex, and I didn't want a train crossing to create more traffic than necessary. And of course, having the train go up a slope and to cross the road that way, in theory it could be possible, but it would just I don't think I would like the look of it, and I don't think it would look good. So I decided to have that sort of roadway bridge, and I think that'll be the best solution in the long run, and probably the most realistic, just for the setting and everything. Anyhow, here you can see me experimenting more with the wooden coaster, and I think that at this point, this is all we do for the rest of the episode is work on this coaster. So I will try my best to explain that. So I started with the initial just standard GCI curve drop, and then I sort of had the idea to do something more like Wodan Timber Coaster at Europa Park, where the drop sort of does it curves back in on itself and goes under the lift hill. And this is relatively similar within the constraints of Roller Coaster Tycoon 3. And I started sort of going along that path, and for the most part, it worked. But I wanted to basically make this entire first drop sequence and station, for the most part, identical to Wodan Timber Coaster. So I wanted the drop to sort of go through a tunnel under the station, and then have a station flyby as well. So in that respect, it's all the same, right, where the station is concerned. So you'll see as we move on how that all sort of pans out. And in the meantime, I'm just sort of doing like a standard fast-paced roller coaster layout, or that's sort of what I was starting with. I don't remember where I started and where I ended up, because it was all, I mean, there were quite a bit of changes and lots of experimentation, and that's definitely, it's always a good idea to have in mind what end product you want when you're building roller coasters, um, but never, put yourself above experimentation and finding what works. And yeah, I really wanted something that wrapped around itself and stayed low to the ground, but traveled really quickly, and kind of like Maverick. I feel like Maverick is sort of the that's like where I set my bar for a Western themed roller coaster. Even if I'm doing which, if you don't know, by the way, Maverick is of course a roller coaster at Cedar Point, a steel roller coaster. But just having those fast and low to the ground whippy transitions, I feel like that really is the essence of like a good Western themed roller coaster. Um, so that's sort of what I wanted to have with this ride. Another ride that I guess was sort of a reference for this was El Toro at Six Flags Great Adventure, which of course is a wooden roller coaster if you are unfamiliar. And that one, in fact, this sort of back section of the ride is probably more comparable to that in the way it crisscrosses itself and turns around and everything. Certainly not identical. And a quick little side note here. Um, my initial idea, so I started constructing something similar to our little, oh, I don't even know what you would call it, but basically something that would be a height reference for the roadway, the perimeter road that will travel underneath our roller coaster. And I needed that reference point, obviously, because we want to have the overpasses tall enough so that way trucks and vehicles can get underneath them. So I found the height of the other little overpass we had built for on the corner of our medieval section, and I found that height and used it as a reference. And I built a little structure that I intended on copy and pasting, but I realized for the sake of design, this thing was going to change quite a bit. So I changed it so that way I basically just used the flat western roof pieces instead, and that worked just fine. So I could move them around and everything as I needed while I was designing this. Anyhow, I'm getting behind. Surprisingly, didn't think that would be an issue in this episode. But right here, we are designing the station flyby, and I decided to design that basically on its own and try and work my way backwards because I didn't know how I was going to get there from my current position. So I decided, well, I'll just I'll put this flyby in because I know where I want it to be relative to the station, and then I'll work my way backwards and find a point where I can more or less line up with the rest of the track. And that worked pretty well, as you can see. And GCIs, I'll make this note now, they're one of my favorite roller coasters to design in Roller Coaster Tycoon 3. Um, Especially one of my favorite ways to design a wooden roller coaster because I feel like the way GCIs flow, and in case you're unaware, GCI stands for Great Coasters International, which is a roller coaster manufacturer, and their roller coasters have a very rhythmic pacing about them, and they if you look up you can look up a video of like top 10 GCIs and you'll see what I mean. They all have this similar flow and it is a rhythm about them. I don't know how else to explain their pacing, but basically, um, it translates really well to Roller Coaster Tycoon 3 because Roller Coaster Tycoon 3, um, it's a very snappy coaster designer. I mean, everything is based on 45 or 90-degree angles, and the banking is set to one rigid angle, and it's certainly not realistic in the real world sense. But when it comes to things like designing GCIs, I feel like the Roller Coaster Tycoon 3 editor, it works so well. So because all the snaps and transitions are very rigid uh, in that way. If I'm making sense, let me know if I'm not. But I think you'll see what I mean if you find some roller coaster POVs on YouTube of GCI roller coasters. So anyway, moving on. Uh, yes, so we had caught up to our little station flyby, and then I designed the ending of the ride. And the ending of the ride will still undergo further changes throughout the rest of this video. And even the pre-drop section will change a little bit, um, as you will see. So while I was designing this, when I finished, I realized I didn't have a spot for a storage track or any sort of transfer track. So I sort of had to redesign that final section, and you can see where I mapped out on the ground where I'll eventually build those things um, with enough space to accommodate 3 trains. And I wanted to design this section, around that. But one thing you'll have seen in both iterations now is a wide turn, sort of low to the ground, and right there where all the guests will be able to walk. Obviously, we don't have a pathway in there yet, but eventually I want it to have like a pathway right around that turn and something that guests can really be right up against and sort of interact with, and hype them up for the ride if they haven't ridden it yet. Just something that'll look really cool. So you can see me working on that there. But again, I mean, this is not the final ending, and it underwent a number of changes, um, as you will soon see. I think I'm trying to look ahead here, as I've done before, trying to figure out what's coming next in the POV. Um, and I'm trying to remember too my reasoning for changing things up. Um, but I guess I'll just try and talk about the design process. So I guess my big reason for trying to change things is like you can see right along here, there's quite a bit of straight track, and I'm probably one of the few roller coaster enthusiasts who appreciates straight track. Obviously, I wouldn't want to ride a ride that's just straight track, but it in the right context, I think it can work well for a ride, and that goes for any ride. However, you don't want your straight track sections to be too long or what have you. So, and of course, along there, it was kind of getting to be lengthy. So, I was trying to redesign around that and try and make it not so boring. And that will come in a little bit. You'll see how we approach that after we finish redesigning the pre-drop, and I'll explain when I'm done with that why I ended up redoing the ending once more, because how I had it was going to be the final ending. So I wanted to redesign the pre-drop because I didn't care for how it went right into the banking, and I realized that there's this unique sort of piece thing you can do with wooden coasters, which you may have seen. Um, if you start with a flat, slightly downward sloped, or I should say unbanked and slightly downward sloped piece, if you do the sharp left or right turn and bank it in the same direction that you're turning, um, it creates this piece where I don't know how to explain it, but it goes to a flat pitch with banking. And if you rewind and look at me designing that, you'll see what I mean. But basically, I wanted to do that because it has a more gradual transition into the banking, which I think works a little better for a slow pre-drop section. Going right into a big turning drop, I think it would have been fine to have it go right into the banking. In fact, we would have had to have done that because there's only a tight turn version of that piece. But anyway, so I wanted to include that, and so you can see we have to reprofile that pre-drop a little bit. And right now, what I've been doing is designing the pre-lift section. So if you have a roller coaster with one long block zone before the final brake run, it's good to have, in RollerCoaster Tycoon 3 especially, it's good to have a long pre-lift or a longer pre-lift section. And that is so you can dispatch trains earlier and it'll take them more time to get to the top of the lift. Because if they get to the top of the lift before the following train passes the final brake run, it will stop. And that's a situation generally in an amusement park you want to avoid. Obviously, it's a safety measure for a ride to stop, and it should stop if the following block is not cleared. If you don't know what a block zone is, just watch any El Toro Ryan video. But anyway, but ideally you don't want to do that just because it's not as fun for the guests. Um, so, so having a longer pre-lift can help you dispatch trains quicker, but still have a good interval, good dispatch interval. And moving on, finally we are getting to our final section and the final form it will take. So I decided I wanted to have sort of a nice, big, like, I don't know what to call it, but a nice upward slope turn into a final turnaround. And what I came up with was something kind of similar to Renegade at Valley Fair, which is a GCI roller coaster. But it has these similar turning moments where it sort of goes up in the air and then stays up at a certain elevation for a little while and then dives back down towards the ground. And it's very similar to that big sweeping turn I did there. And I was also able to include that low to the ground final turn of the ride as well. And I think all that worked a lot better as an ending, sort of grand finale to the ride. And we did have a little bit of straight track, but we were able to break it up there with a helix. And initially, I think I had a double down section, which you could also do. I think that also would have worked great. But I decided having a helix would probably just help fill out that space a little better and make the ride a little bit longer. Anyhow, we are at the end of the video, and somehow I managed to not really lose my train of thought very much throughout all that. So I guess I'll consider that a win in my book. Anyhow, I will let you guys enjoy the rest of this POV. Have a great rest of your day, and I will see you all in the next episode. Goodbye.